All right, here in the last section of Chapter 13, we're going to talk about how we turned from a sectional crisis to a national crisis. White anti-slavery leaders hailed Fremont's defeat as a glorious one and looked ahead to the party's future successes. For those still in slavery or hoping to see loved ones freed, the news was, of course, much harder to take. The Republican Party had promised the rise of anti-slavery coalition, but voters rebuked it. The lesson seemed clear enough. Kansas loomed large over the 1856 election, darkening the national mood. The story of voter fraud in Kansas had begun years before in 1854, when nearby Missourians first started crossing the border to tamper with the Kansas election. Noting this, critics at the time attacked the Pierce administration for not living up to its ideas of popular sovereignty by ensuring fair elections. From there, the crisis only deepened. Kansas voted to come into the Union as a free state, but the federal government refused to recognize their votes and instead recognized a sham pro-slavery legislature. The sectional crisis had at last become a national crisis. Bleeding Kansas was the first place to demonstrate that the sectional crisis could easily be, and in fact already was, exploding into a full-blown national crisis. As the national mood grew increasingly grim, Kansas attracted militants representing the extreme sides of the slavery debate. In the days after the 1856 presidential election, Buchanan made his plans for his time in office clear. He talked with Chief Justice Roger Taney on Inauguration Day about a court decision he hoped to see handed out during his time in office. Indeed, not long after the inauguration, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that would come to define Buchanan's presidency. This was called the Dred Scott decision, which you need to know for quiz purposes. The Dred Scott decision was the decision in the case Scott v. Sanford, which ruled that black Americans could not be citizens of the United States. Straight up. This gave the Buchanan administration and its Southern allies a direct repudiation of the Missouri Compromise. The court ruled that Scott, a Missouri slave, had no right to sue the United States courts. The Dred Scott decision signaled that the federal government was now fully committed to extending slavery as far and as wide as it might want. The Dred Scott decision seemed to settle the sectional crisis by making slavery fully national, but in reality, it just exacerbated sectional tensions further. In 1857, Buchanan sent U.S. military forces to Utah, hoping to subdue Utah's Mormon communities. This action, however, led to renewed charges, many of them leveled from within his own party, that the administration was abusing its powers. Far more important than the Utah invasion, however, were the ongoing events in Kansas. It was Kansas that at last proved to many Northerners that the sectional crisis would not go away unless slavery went away also. The Illinois Senate race in 1858 put the scope of the sectional crisis on full display. Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln challenged a greatly influential Democrat, Stephen Douglas. Pandering to appeals to white supremacy, Douglas hammered the Republican opposition as a black Republican Party bent on racial equality. The Republicans, including Lincoln, were thrown on the defensive. Democrats hung on best they could, but the Republicans won the House of Representatives and picked up seats in the Senate. Lincoln actually lost his contest with Stephen Douglas, but in the process firmly established himself as a leading national Republican. After the 1858 election, all eyes turned to 1860. Given the Republican Party's successes since 1854, it was expected that the 1860 presidential election might produce the nation's first anti-slavery president. In the troubled decades since the Missouri Compromise, the nation slowly tore itself apart. Congressmen clubbed each other nearly to death on the floor of Congress, and by the middle of the 1850s, Americans were already at war on the Kansas and Missouri plains. Across the country, cities and towns were in various stages of revolt against federal authority. Fighting spread even further against the Indians in the far west and against the Mormons in Utah. The nation's militants anticipated a coming breakdown and worked to exploit it. John Brown, fresh from his actions in Kansas, moved east and planned more violence. Assembling a team across the West, including black radicals from Oberlin, Ohio, and throughout communities in Western Canada, Brown hatched a plan to attack Harper's Ferry, a federal weapons arsenal in Virginia, now in West Virginia. He could use the weapons to lead a slave revolt. Brown approached Frederick Douglass, though Douglass refused to join him. Brown's raid embarked on October 16th, but by October 18th, a command under Robert E. Lee had crushed the revolt. Many of Brown's men, including his own sons, were killed, but Brown himself lived and was imprisoned. Brown prophesied while in prison that the nation's crimes would only be purged with blood. He went to the gallows in December of 1859. Northerners made a stunning display of sympathy on the day of his execution, while Southerners took their reactions to mean that the coming 1860 election would be in many ways a referendum on secession and disunion. Republicans wanted little to do with Brown, instead tried to portray themselves as moderate, opposed to both abolitionists and pro-slavery expansionists. In this climate, the parties opened their contest for the 1860 election. The Democratic Party fared poorly as its Southern delegates bolted its national convention at Charleston and ran their own candidate, Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, hoping to field a candidate who might nonetheless manage to bridge the broken party's factions. The Democrats decided to meet again at Baltimore and nominated Stephen Douglas of Illinois. The Republicans, meanwhile, held their boisterous convention in Chicago. The Republican platform made the party's anti-slavery commitments clear, also making wide promises to its white constituents, particularly Westerners, with the promise of new land, transcontinental railroads, and broad support for public schools. For quiz purposes, you need to know that Abraham Lincoln was a candidate few outside of Illinois truly expected to win, but he proved far less polarizing than the other names on the ballot, and this is why he was chosen. He won the nomination, and with the Democrats in disarray, Republicans knew that their candidate Lincoln had a good chance of winning. Abraham Lincoln actually won the 1860 contest on November 6th, gaining just 40% of the popular vote and not a single Southern vote in the Electoral College. Within days, Southern states were organizing secession conventions. John C. Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a series of compromises, but a clear pro-Southern bias meant that they had little chance of gaining Republican acceptance. Crittenden's plan promised renewed enforcement of the fugitive slave law and offered a plan to keep slavery in the nation's capital. Republicans by late 1860 knew that the voters who had just placed them in power did not want them to cave on these points, and the Southern states proceeded with their plans to leave the Union. On December 20th, South Carolina voted to secede and issued a declaration of immediate causes. The declaration highlighted the failure of the federal government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act over competing personal liberty laws in the northern states. After the war, many Southerners claimed that secession was primarily voted by a concern to preserve slave states' rights. But the primary complaint on the very first ordinance of secession listed the federal government's failure to exert its authority over the northern states. The year of 1861 saw the culmination of the secession crisis. Before he left for Washington, Lincoln told those who had gathered in Springfield to wish him well that he faced a task greater than Washington's in the years to come. Southerners were also learning the challenges of forming a new nation. The seceded states grappled with internal divisions right away, as states with slaveholders sometimes did not support the newly seceded states. In January, for example, Delaware rejected secession, but states in the lower South adopted a different course. The state of Mississippi seceded. Later in the month, the states of Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana also all left the Union. By early February, Texas had joined the newly seceded states. In February, Southerners drafted a constitution protecting slavery and named Jefferson Davis of Mississippi their president. Weeks after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, rebels in the newly formed Confederate States of America opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and within days, Abraham Lincoln would demand 75,000 volunteers from the North to crush this rebellion. The American Civil War had begun.